So I'm Jane Turner. I work for Brighter Futures, and for the last 4 years, I've been running the Housing First Stoke-on-Trent service. Housing First is an approach to tackling homelessness for people with complex and multiple needs, where they have experienced long periods of homelessness or repeat homelessness, and where traditional services have not worked for them. Housing First is based on the principle of helping people get straight into accommodation of their own that can be their permanent home, and that the safety and the control that gives them often then means that they feel able to tackle some of the other issues and start to work towards achieving their goals. Housing First Stoke-on-Trent was funded by the lottery via the Voices Fulfilling Lives project. And in the third year of our service, we were able to apply for some funding from Homeless Link to look at enhancing our service by employing a specialist homeless women's worker. And we wanted to have a look at what it would mean to apply a gender-informed approach to Housing First, and start to look at what the particular needs of women were in our service. So, as I said, the funding came from Homeless Link to enhance the support to women on our caseload. The way that we did it was our specialist homeless women's worker was an extra worker. She didn't take the lead in all of the cases that she was supporting, but she was able to have a look at what gaps there were in the support that was provided by our service coordinators. What she also was able to do is start to identify gaps in the services and start to look at some systems barriers that there were that sometimes prevented women from receiving the support that they needed. We commissioned an evaluation from Staffordshire University's Centre for Health and Development, because we wanted them to have a look at 3 areas. First of all, the confirmation really of what additional needs women had. Secondly, have a look at the effectiveness of our service and the specialist homeless women's worker role. And thirdly, to look at whether they felt that there were any recommendations for other service providers or for commissioners in order to improve the service provided to women who are homeless and experiencing multiple disadvantage. So I'm going to talk about the recommendations that they found through that evaluation. The Centre for Health and Development came up with 4 key areas of recommendations. First of all, for commissioners and funders. Second, there were a set of recommendations for service delivery and for partner agencies at that front line. Thirdly, there were some specific recommendations around provision of safe accommodation for women. And finally, they had some recommendations for some further research and evaluation. There were 4 recommendations for each of those areas, because I think it's useful for us to be able to think about our own services critically and have a think about what we can do ourselves to improve our service for women. And also then I'm going to take you through some recommendations for wider provision, looking at partner agencies and accommodation providers. So first of all, recommendations for service delivery. First of all, the Centre for Health and Development found that there was a need generally to improve awareness of women's experiences. Now, what we found in our service was the majority of women that we were supporting had experience of complex trauma, which is different from a one-off experience of trauma and different from chronic trauma. Complex trauma is trauma that starts from childhood, that could be a result of a number of different kinds of trauma. It could be trauma connected to attachment and parenting. It could be trauma related to abuse, for example. And that specifically, complex trauma, really affects women's trust in other services, and it also means that it's very easy to trigger a fight or flight response, because they've obviously experienced that trauma through their developing years. That whole area of understanding complex trauma and how we need to work as service providers, that trauma-informed approach, is something that really came up in this research. Women are more likely to have complex experience of complex trauma, and also to have experienced interpersonal abuse and violence, controlling relationships, and all of those kind of compound to create barriers to engaging with the current system of services, where services don't understand that experience. The second recommendation is around a commitment to small caseloads to reflect that the time and flexibility is needed to build trust and relationships. A lot of Housing First service providers find that the standard caseload in Housing First services is that you work with up to 7 people. For services focusing on women, they recommend that each worker only works with up to 5 women because of the additional time that's needed to build that relationship. And actually what we also found in our delivery is that a lot of the time a crisis can get in the way of starting to look at longer goals, so you just need more time invested. Thirdly, they found that it was important to acknowledge women's experience of motherhood without stigma or prejudice, because parenthood can be an important part of a woman's identity, regardless of where the children are currently living. And yet it's one of the things that tends to be very much unspoken in traditional homeless services, that the standard assessment doesn't tend to ask people about what the name of the kids are and where they're living at the moment, and are they having any contact. And then the fourth recommendation for service delivery is that we need to take a closer look at security and safety in women's homes. That can include things like some CCTV or video doorbells to help improve safety and security. It's about being able to know who's at your door before you choose to go and open it. And if you just have like a little spyglass or a glass panel in your door, someone can see that you're there. And it can be very, very hard to refuse entry from someone that might be there to cause harm. And that's certainly one of the things in Housing First that we found, is that it's quite challenging often for women to maintain control of their own tenancies. Okay, so the next set of recommendations are for service delivery partners. So this is about improving understanding about the system of support available locally and how accessible it is in practice for women with experience of multiple disadvantage. We worked with Chad on this evaluation, and one of the things that we're really pleased that they included in the recommendation is some training for all to improve awareness of women's experiences of homelessness, to include gender-informed and trauma-informed approaches, and consideration of different ways to engage with women. And this leads us on to the third recommendation: more work with partners around engaging women experiencing multiple disadvantage and identifying more creative and flexible solutions and ways of working that would benefit all. An example of this is where perhaps a service is dependent on somebody attending set appointments. There may be telephone appointments, there may be in-person appointments, and often if somebody doesn't answer the phone or doesn't turn up, there's, if you're lucky, 3 strikes and you're out and off the books and have to start the process of reapplying to that service. Now, if you understand complex trauma and if your service is gender informed, you might be aware that there are a lot of barriers that may prevent somebody from accessing a service in that way. It doesn't mean they don't want or need that support, but it's about recognising sometimes you need to take a much more assertive approach and creative approach to engaging with the women who need your support. Finally, there was a recommendation that there should be some further work with police on improving their responses to reports of sexual abuse and domestic abuse for women experiencing or at risk of homelessness and multiple disadvantage. And there are further examples in the full evaluation report published by the Centre for Health and Development that gives some examples of where that hasn't happened. And I think often perhaps where women are misusing substances or engaged in sex work, and where they've experienced complex trauma, it can be quite difficult for them to feel believed and trusted, for them to believe that they can trust the police, that they'll give an appropriate response. So that's why that's another of the recommendations. Okay, so finally, I'm going to move on to recommendations around access for accommodation. Now, for Housing First services, as you could imagine, this is a real key area. It's really important that there is quick access to appropriate, safe housing in an area of choice, so that the people that we support can feel safe, and we can start building our support network around them to help them to keep that tenancy, keep that home. The recommendations specifically related to women from this report are that housing needs assessments should be gender informed to ensure that consideration is given to a woman's specific needs and vulnerability, and that there need to be more emergency accommodation options for women with experience of multiple disadvantage. So often the options that are available to the local authority are mixed sex hostels, mixed sex hotels, and if someone's actually at risk of harm from, a specific individual, an ex-partner, for example, to move somewhere like a hotel just does not feel safe. And it may well be that there are other people who are also staying there who are coming away from rough sleeping, who are associates of people that may have caused the woman harm. There just needs to be a much wider range of options available for women specific to their needs, and also where there's no requirement for evidence from police, because very often women with experience of complex trauma, there's any number of barriers for them to report issues to the police, so there may not be police records providing evidence of abuse that they've experienced. Thirdly, drug and alcohol services should offer rapid access to treatments to help women gain access to women-only emergency accommodation that is often not available for women who are actively misusing substances. For example, refuge accommodation. If you're not in receipt of drug treatment, for example, if you're not on a methadone script and you're using heroin, you won't be able to access it, or it's very unlikely that you'll be able to access a refuge and the appropriate support that you need. And it can take a long time sometimes to get through the process to start drug treatment. So that's one of the recommendations, is that rapid access to treatment would really help. And finally, that domestic abuse services specifically should have an accessible offer for women experiencing multiple disadvantage, and think about how they can provide a service for women that may have, I guess, a lot going on, whether they're still in an abusive relationship, whether they are ready to leave that relationship but require additional support. The recommendation is that domestic abuse services should do the work and thinking around that, and how they can make their services available for women experiencing multiple disadvantage. Okay, I hope that's useful. Please note that on our website there is a link to the full report with all of the recommendations from the Centre for Health and Development at Staffordshire University, looking at how to improve services for women experiencing homelessness and multiple disadvantage, and also a lot more information about the effectiveness of our approach in Housing First with our Specialist Homeless Women's Project. Thank you.